creativity is a very kind of fluffy, big concept, and I think. But if you look at the psychology of creativity, we know that creativity can be defined as being able to first of all think divergently, so that you can connect different ideas, and convergently at the same time. So that has to be applicable, has to be make a positive contribution to something. It has to have an added value to something.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker. And this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration and advice while at home, at work or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode as well as free training on creativity over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor and I'm delighted today to be joined by Thomas Zoëga Ramsøy. Thomas is considered one of the leading scholars and practitioners in applied neuroscience. His main interest is in how the brain makes decisions. Besides being a prolific writer of scientific articles and textbooks on the matter, he also consults Fortune 500 companies within industries such as retail, social media, technology, pharmaceuticals, and entertainment. Thomas is also associated with Singularity University in Silicon Valley. His new co-authored book is called Leading Transformation: How to Take Care of Your Company's Future. It's my great pleasure to have Thomas with us today. So welcome, Thomas.
Thanks a lot. Pleasure to be here.
So share with everyone what's happening in your world just now.
Well, today is the day that the book comes out. So that's the first thing. So it's we have had a little micro celebration here at the office. So that's great. Other than that, working on a ton of different projects, of course. Anything from redefining social media with some of the leading social media channels, all the way to initiating a big EU-funded project next week in Valencia. So it's anything from academic to highly applied research.
Now, we have a lot of authors and aspiring authors that watch this show as well. So I would love to know, how does it feel today? First of all, how long has this book been in the making? And how does it feel today when the book finally comes out?
Well, yeah. So how the book came about is it all started way back to, I think, 2012, 2013. That's kind of when I met Carl Nell. He came to Copenhagen straight from Mexico, poor guy, in a cold January or December morning. And we started talking about the possibility of combining psychology, economics, and neuroscience to the challenges he had. And I think that was, when we started talking about that this needed kind of a reconceptualization of, what it means to do research, and especially in terms of innovation. How can we have, guardrails? How can we have ways to help us guide the innovation process? And that's kind of, we've gone through several iterations of, talking about a book that came about along the way. But then once we met Nathan Furr, not too long ago, I think it's almost 2 years ago, less than that actually, it really sped up. And I think with Nathan's, his push and his drive to make, a physical product out of this, it really took off. And, we actually wrote the book in a fairly quick time. So I think that the actual writing process was just in a matter of months. So a long lead up and then a really kind of, almost like a sprint-like writing process.
Now, your company, the book is obviously based on a lot of research and is based on a lot of you working with great clients and testing these things, iterating upon them as well, and some of the principles that come out in the book as well. I know you've worked a lot with Lowe's Innovation Labs as part of this book, and that there's kind of case study around that, and also Tesco, which is based here in the UK as well. So tell us about the work with Lowe's. I think about Lowe's, this kind of DIY store, very much in the US. What use would they have of understanding, the psychology? How did you start? What was the initial brief that you started working with them, and how did you add value to them?
Yeah, this basically started as a kind of research question. What kind of research can we do to advance our understanding of consumer behaviors? So that was kind of one thing that was interesting, because I think there's a realization in the industry, the research industry, that just doing another survey and a focus group and an interview, it brings you only part of the way, so to speak, to understand why people choose the way they choose. And there's a realization of when you talk about behavioral economics, that people are biased. They can come up with a nice little narrative for why they choose what they choose, but eventually and at the end of the day, they're driven by very subconscious processes. And from a kind of a neuroscience perspective, and from a psychology perspective, we've taken in neuroscience for a long time. So I think that again, going back to that meeting with Carl Nell, for example, we started discussing how can we advance this level of understanding of consumer behavior. So that was one thing. The other thing is that there was a keen interest to start redefining what Lowe's was. That kind of it's always good to easy to say that in retrospect. But I think that from the very first days, we started testing things like VR, AR, human-robot interaction, 3D printing, long before Oculus went on Kickstarter. So I think that there was a keen interest to start thinking about, are there any other models that we can see in this foreseeable future that Lowe's can position themselves differently. So that's kind of the mix of and mashup of all of that ended up in what we end up with as the book today.
So tell me, in terms of the level of interaction you have, let's say with a client like that, large company, did they obviously put together an innovation lab? I'd be interested to know that they put it in the same physical building as the rest of the company, and how do you, as kind of outside consultants and researchers, work with those innovation labs? Because I hear there's lots of different ways that companies can develop, obviously work with innovation. They can do more internal, external, those kind of hybrid models. What model have you found to work with Lowe's?
I think what Lowe's decided to do differently, of course, they tried a lot of different other models as well before this came on. Of course, the traditional way of doing it is, hiring some kind of long-bearded guys, put them into this kind of strange place, typically in Silicon Valley, and you send the C-suite team out just visiting them, going into this safari, just looking at the strange people doing strange stuff. I think that only leads to certain types of insights, and it more kind of, it's like a patch on the uncertainty of, let's do some innovation. What Lowe's was doing differently was that they assigned initially a small team, but that then grew larger and larger. They also set, it started, North Carolina is the headquarters for Lowe's, but they also put other hubs different places. First of all, they had to have a finger on the pulse with what was going on in Silicon Valley and some other innovation hubs as well. So having presence there was important. But then they also set up labs different places, such as Seattle, for example, and other places as well. So, and also, over time into Bangalore in India, for example, as well. What Lowe's was doing very differently, and also Carl Nell was doing very differently, was to establish what he called uncommon partners. So this is the whole idea, is that Lowe's was beginning to start collaborating with companies that you wouldn't think that they would collaborate with. Because Lowe's had certain types of data or certain types of insights that they can actually use as a currency to negotiate with these companies, because they didn't have access to that. And that meant that you can actually contribute in a very meaningful synergetic relationship and create something novel. And at the same time, Lowe's could then go back and say, we can actually test some of the new technologies before they are out on the market. And that would also be a competitive advantage as well.
So the work you've done obviously in the neuroscience side, you've done a lot in terms of consumer behavior. I'm interested in how you obviously ran innovation, how that kind of touches on the creativity side. I mean, I think a brand like Lowe's, and I think, people are going in there to buy certain types of things because they have like just a certain type of job to do. But then there are also people that are kind of going in there looking to build, to create something as well. How do you, can neuroscience actually help us understand creativity and what maybe role creativity has in the buying process? Oh,
sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think, of course, creativity is a very kind of fluffy, big concept. And I think, but if you look at the psychology of creativity, we know that creativity can be defined as, being able to, first of all, think divergently, so that you can connect different ideas, and convergently at the same time. So that has to be applicable, it has to be, make a positive contribution to something. It has to have an added value to something. And I think that very early on, we realized that creativity in that sense, first of all, Lowe's as a company are trying to sell ideas and also to help people create through, through their solutions and their services, and also through, their store associates are trying to help people facilitate that need and want. But at the same time, we also used the whole idea to Lowe's own team. So how can we make sure that the knowledge we have from psychology, from neuropsychology and neuroscience to boost creativity at Lowe's, for example? And this is also something we repeat in other teams as well. At the same time, I was still working some years, in parallel at the Copenhagen Business School and University Hospital in Copenhagen, and we were doing some studies to understand, the foundations of creativity. And what we did through my lab was then to identify, first of all, through some fMRI studies, we found that people who are more creative, they tend to have a kind of extra flurry of activation in certain memory structures when they just look at objects, for example. So that means that there's something automatic about being creative that, there's a foundational knowledge that this seems to be kind of a foundation of being creative. It's not that something you have to force, but it just happens all the time. And other things such as, through my lab as well, one of my PhD students used neuroscience as a way to teach people about, the neuroscience of creativity, which in itself actually boosted people's creativity by almost 30%. So things like that, we use kind of you can call it translational science. We use the insights from that kind of basic science, and we applied it and tested it on teams, tested it in different conditions, and we set up experiments. So we use kind of a good connection between the basic research and then applied research as well. I think that was the unique thing. We use it both for employees, but we definitely also use it for customer research as well.
And then what you do is very much about application. So we have this other worker or groups of workers coming into the workplace now, into the job force, which are AIs and robotics. A different type of worker that's coming in now. Are there actually any things? A lot of them are built using kind of neural networks and machine learning. Are there any things that the folks that are working more in the AI labs can learn from in terms of how the humans wire their brain to do innovative and creative work?
Oh, well, absolutely. I think that we have, to some extent, we've been very kind of focused on this analogy between the human brain and how the computer operates. And, we call it neural networks as an analogy, as a name of how, the brain basically. And I think that to some extent, this is by, in the idea of that is correct, but I think the actual implementation of that has been severely limited. I think that we're still lacking. First of all, we don't really have a complete understanding of the brain, but I think that there's still a gap between what we actually know about the brain and the knowledge that we have that we apply in AI research, for example. And of course, there are some criticism in terms of AI that it's the new alchemy or something like that. We shouldn't forget that. So I think that, but if you really look at those that try to look at and use the understanding from neuroscience to AI, I think that's the right route to take, but it shouldn't be the only route to take. We shouldn't model AI on the brain, but it should be inspiring. But then I think AI should also take some parallel separate routes as well.
I mean, do you have a fear, for example, some of the clients you work with, you use a lot in terms of eye movement. So if someone goes into a store, the sensor, they're basically tracking their eye movement, where their eyes are going, and I'm imagining those spaces on those in those stores will have a higher premium. Maybe the ones that don't, or how their eyes move around. So I guess that that can be gamed over a while. Do you have a worry that maybe we kind of lose almost a sense of our free will as humans, where some of these algorithms are able to actually almost know our decisions before we make them?
Yeah, look, I think that yes, you're absolutely right. I think this is technology facilitates basically what we already know. A great salesperson 500 years ago would know exactly how to sell me a carpet, even though I didn't need it. So I think that there are certain tricks of the mind that we can learn without really knowing the brain, or really having access to all these data. But on the other side, I think that the new knowledge that we have through either neuroscience or biometrics or external sensing from other sensors, as you mentioned as well, that gives us, and it gives a lot of companies a huge potential for abuse. I think that this is not something we should take lightly, and I think that it definitely needs to be discussed. And for me, I think it's a couple of ways that we need to think about it. First, it needs to be connected to some kind of corporate social responsibility. That's I think the most companies we work with, or all the companies we work with at least, have this responsibility. They definitely have a sense of responsibility of how far should it go and where where shouldn't it apply. And I think that the other thing would be how we can use this basically the knowledge we have. So if you read Dan Ariely, for example, you as a consumer, you can actually learn more about yourself, and then by doing that, you can actually learn to de-bias yourself. So we shouldn't just take it as a one-way route and say, this knowledge, this new technology is only something that can impact us in a negative way. It can actually also be used by me to improve myself. And the third route would say, I would also say that we see more and more that this technology, it doesn't only lead to, it doesn't take away people's autonomy. But what we very often see is that we take away the bad ads, for example. We take away the bad products before they even come to the shelf. So I think at this time, we see that neuroscience, for example, is helping companies improve their solutions and services. And it goes from persuasion more to engagement. And I think that's a realization that companies are doing these days as well.
So, and I've heard you speak before about obviously these idea of like biases. We have these kind of mental biases, these frameworks that are very easy to slip into. You had a real aha moment when you were doing some work maybe earlier in your career, when you were working with clients. You talked about this, some certain biases, some things that happen in the brain. Could you talk about that kind of aha moment you had, which has then gone on to very much influence to what you do today with brands?
Well, I think, was it clients or was it patients? I'm not sure if I'm...
Patients, yeah. I'm just saying in terms of the patients, you talked about this, you worked with like dementia patients, for example. I thought, okay, how does dementia patients relate to those big brands that are selling products and services?
Exactly. And I think I had some years after I graduated as a neuropsychologist, I worked some years as a clinical neuropsychologist, and I was fortunate as a profession to see a lot of different types of patients, which gave me a very kind of, in many ways, it gives you this kind of strange idea that the mind doesn't work as you naively think that it does. And to me, I had at least a couple of patients that really kind of, turned my head around for a long time before I actually realized what was going on. And I think that they were kind of bubbling in my head for a couple of years actually before I realized what was going on. One patient was a patient that had a stroke in his right parietal lobe. He was paralyzed in his left side of his body, so there's a crossing so that the right brain is controlling the left body. And he was paralyzed, but on top of that, since he had this lesion, he also had what is called a unilateral neglect. And what that means is that anything left to him, if it's the body, if it's his visual field, if it's anything else, he ignores it. He doesn't attend it. And it's not because he's repressing it or anything like that. It doesn't exist to him. So basically, he would only shave, the right side of his face. He would only take clothes on the right side, but not the left side. He would typically complain about having less food than other patients because he could only attend to, half of the plate. And on top of that, certain patients like this one, he also had this problem called anosognosia. And that's basically a failure to recognize that you have a disorder or have a problem. So one thing is that you might have this problem, but if you realize it, you can compensate and you can come up with solutions for it. But if you, on top of that, you fail to recognize that you have a problem, then that's really the hardest kind of case for patients. And in this case, he didn't realize that. On the other side, I had another patient that had a debut with psychosis, if you like. He was experiencing his daughter and her family all of a sudden sitting in his living room in his home without any pre-warning. And he thought that was nice. He started serving, coffee, tea, cakes, and things like that. But then nothing happened. They were just sitting there still in his living room, and nothing happened. They didn't, drink or eat anything. And he took off all the things again and came into the living room again, and they were gone. So that happened a couple of times, and he was, calling his daughter and kind of yelling a little bit at her and said, this is really disappointing. You come here without any warning, you don't take any coffee or anything. But the third time it happened, he started thinking, maybe it's not them, maybe it's something with me. So that critical realization made him think that, there's something about my mind that is not right. And that contrast between the two patients here, it bubbled for a long time. And I realized that there's something in our minds that there's a narrator, if you like. There's a storyteller in our head that makes up a coherent story. Now, I realized there were other academics and other clinicians that came up with the term the narrator for this term, and I thought for a long time, of course, that this is unique to brain injury. But soon did I realize, as soon as I started talking about decision making in the brain, saw that, and of course, I came from the clinical side, did not know much about behavioral economics, but of course, once I realized that behavioral economics had identified several of these kind of biases that we had, I connected, 2 and 2 or 4 or 4, whatever, and I said that there's something going on here that we need to understand the more kind of foundations of.
So as you that role of the narrator, it gives us a sense of that we're involved in something and we have a role to play in that as well. I'm interested, like how brands can use that. You hear now a lot of the brands talking about being a movement, being more than just it's an individual product or a sense. It's like almost like creating that story. So where does what can we learn as from the advertising industry and as people, companies are building brands as marketers, that of these biases exist, those things that are happening in the brain anyway, there's ways that we can actually use these, hopefully for good.
Yeah. I think the most famous examples is, of course, kind of the Coca-Cola effect. And even as a neuroscientist, I would say that we don't even need to go all to kind of the narration part with the storytelling part for the brand. As a neuroscientist, I see a brand as something that provides value, that imbues value to a product. And that happens at an instance. And, we've done this so many times with Coca-Cola. We've done it with wine. We did it with prices of wine. We've done that for different types of, clothing, for fashion, for art and stuff like that. And what we've seen again and again is that when you provide a cue, so that could be the brand name, for example, it leads to, in a microsecond, it leads to an expectation effect that is so subtle and so subconscious, you can't control for it. It actually impacts both the likelihood that you will look at something, it will impact the likelihood that you will spend more time with it, and also that you will have a positive response to it. And even it will, it would even affect your, your experience of the product. So the taste of something, for example. So it's something that happens within an instant, and we're so trained to it subconsciously. So brands operate as a kind of a super-heuristic, and I think that's the strongest power that we have with brands. It's when it goes from that conscious narrative, if you like, all the way down to the immediate subconscious emotional expectation. That's the strongest power of a brand. Because if you look at products in general, there's very often we see products are they're equal in many respects. And what actually provides a value, it's our expectation, it's our story, it's our what we have learned to associate with a particular brand. So, and I think that's the power of brands. And I think in all this talk we have about the brand narrative, I think it kind of we should kind of look a little bit back and look at the foundations of what a brand actually is.
So how in your work you came from this world of academia and working in there, and then you've definitely moved into working with large companies, brands, and helping them take some of these learnings and apply them into business as well. Was that a difficult decision to make? Because I think of the world of academia being quite a maybe quite a closeted place, could be quite maybe comfortable in some respects, and then you're going into this cut and thrust world of of business and helping businesses. Was that an easy decision to make?
It was absolutely an easy decision, I have to say. And it was a combination of a push and pull. I think that, first of all, doing multidisciplinary research, I was working on the cross-field between economic, behavior, psychology, and neuroscience. Now, everyone in academia thinks it's a great thing to do cross-disciplinary work, but first of all, it's really hard to find the right place to sit, because every head of department will tell you have to publish in those kind of core journals. And if they wouldn't even think that a journal like Science would be good enough, because they are so focused on their own turf. So that's one thing. The other thing is getting funding is actually a bit hard as well. And I think that was kind of the push away from academia. And I think in general, academia is suffering from what we see, the replication problem we see in science these days is extreme, because that science has become, in many ways, so inundated with financial issues that we've kind of forgotten about what basic research actually is. And I think I will be preaching to the choir to a lot of academics that I still know that says that yes, it's the whole publish or perish idea is actually extremely horrible. And that means that if you do a study and you don't find any differences between what you want to find, you are stuck with that. That's a huge problem. On the contrary, if you go to a company and they say, we want to test the difference between A, B, and C, and you come back and you say, look, we've looked at everything here. There's no difference between A, B, and C. You shouldn't waste your money on trying to force, anything with these three. You need to look at another place. That has enormous value to a company. So I think there's a different level of honesty in the industry and applied research that you don't see in academic research these days. And that's kind of horrified me a little bit. But it's, right now I feel comfortable doing it. And the big surprise for me is also to find that in applied research, and on the client side, but also with other colleagues, is that I'm meeting like-minded people. These are people with neuroscience backgrounds, psychology backgrounds, that only have interest in doing the correct type of research. So I think that's kind of been the pull towards this as well, is that we can actually do proper science, and some of these clients are actually happy that we publish the research as well.
Yeah, I mean, we think about things like Instagram, for example. How many tests are they doing every day? There's very small behavioral tests in subsections of markets. And yeah, it would be good if more of that information was published more generally to help the world learn from those things. So as we start to finish up here, I'd love to ask some final questions. If there was one book you were to recommend to people, it could be on the areas that you're known for, or just maybe it's a book that's just you've read recently and has really inspired you and has got you thinking differently. What would that book be?
If I have to single out one book, I think it will be one of the latest ones I read, which is Bad Blood by, isn't that Carreyrou? I can't remember his name, but I think Bad Blood, the whole thing about Elizabeth Holmes and the whole sort of, I think that book was really revealing, and I think it's a great story. I just gobbled it up within, I think, 24 hours or something. It was just extremely good, and I think that was a very positive surprise to me. So other than that, I think Harari, Home of You, is actually one of my favorites as well. I love him as an author. So those would be at least two that I would recommend. Yeah,
and he has a wonderful new book out, the 21 Lessons, fantastic new book that he just published. And then what about an online tool or apps? Are there any online tools or apps you find very useful for doing the work that you do?
Oh, that's a good question. I would, of course, point to one of my own tools, but we'll skip that. But I think that I'm very traditional when it comes to actually using online tools. Through my own research, I've found that online tools, especially if you use that on a mobile app, they tend to be, disturbing. They tend to be, and especially working on, a smartphone, in the world that we have, it increases your workload by several, percentage. And that means that the bandwidth you have at your disposal for thinking critically, for, going in depth, is actually lowered just because you're using this device. So I would normally say I'm careful with using apps in general. So I use more like the traditional tools, and I actually take away all the disturbances when I need to work. I think of them as kind of creativity killers, to be honest.
Yeah. So are you very much in kind of journals, moleskin notebooks, or do you prefer thinking through your ideas on big whiteboards? What's your preferred tool then?
Well, we definitely use analog tools, so that will be paper, whiteboards, and things like that. And then, of course, I think as a single tool that we've had very good success with is project management tool that is called Monday.com. Mm-hmm. We've used the lots of different agile tools and the Trellos and everything, and it tends to be like a scattergram that you have tools for this and that, and it doesn't go together. But we find that for project management, for internal development, for your own memory list, and even just a blackboard to write on, I've found that Monday.com is actually a very good solution.
Great, and we'll put these links here as well. What about a slightly unusual question? But if you were to recommend one album or record, what would that be?
I'll have to be a little Norwegian then. I think that one album that really has impacted me, I return to it all the way, is a Norwegian guy called Biosphere, and especially the album called Patashnik. It's ambient music. It's a little dark, but when you play it and think about running around in northern Norway watching the auroras, that will be suitable.
Fantastic. We'll put that link. I'm definitely going to check that one out. And finally, I want you to imagine you woke up tomorrow morning and you have to start from scratch. So you have all the skills, all the knowledge you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you. You know no one. You have to completely restart. What would you do? How would you restart?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a huge question. I think that having the knowledge, I would definitely focus in a different direction. I think that, to be honest, I would start with something I actually did before I started my own company, was to help individuals and help companies more like, reduce stress, optimize decision making within HR and management and leadership, for example. This is something we're actually opening now. But that's also because I would like to return to that thought as well. And so that's, now that we have the capability of that. I think, a big chunk of using, when we talk about behavioral economics, for example, is to talk about biases, right? But it's actually very limited to think of, let's just map these different biases, because it only gets you so far. When you look at the second step to that, is what we call debiasing. And also in psychology, we now start about calling it boosting. And what that means is that we are trying to enforce people to, first of all, pay attention to, am I aware of my bias? And the first step is helping people realize that they have these biases. The second is then to say, if I know this bias, do I know what to do about it? Do I know the direction of change that I need to have? Do I have the cognitive capacity for it? Do I have the time and motivation and so forth? So that's kind of all step-by-step process that you can actually do on every person on this planet to improve their well-being. For some people, that will be from going from minus to zero, and from other people from 0 to plus. But in general, I think that will be kind of the big leap for me in that respect.
And we think about these companies, for example, like Facebook. Facebook will make one very small change, and it might add 3 seconds on to everyone spending time online. And if they have, 3 billion customers, 3 billion times 3 seconds, that's a lot of additional time as well. So that, and obviously, Apple is recognizing it on the new iPhone. They have, how much time you've been spending online. So they are recognizing the dangers to it and kind of giving a little bit of a kind of behavioral economics nudge to certain things. So I would love to see how those things could be applied and making us healthier and happier, more creative individuals. If people want to reach out to you to learn more about the book, which is out now, it's called Leading Transformation, and also just to find out about your work more generally, where's the best place for them to go and do that? So
the book you can find on leadingtransformationbook.com. And for my work, I'm at thomasramsøy.com, and also the company neuronsinc.com is where to find my work as well.
Fantastic. We'll put all these links here. Thomas, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, talking about all these vast areas. We could have spent a lot more time going even more in depth. But thank you so much for coming on today, and all the best with the new book.
Wonderful. It was a pleasure talking to you.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.